Hey guys, so this is my last assignment with y'all. I hate that it has to be like this, but we gotta do what we gotta do. I wish we were more face to face instead of this kind of face to face. But hopefully I'll get to see y'all a lot next year. Maybe I'll be working, like actually working at Cave City, and I'll come to all your games, come see y'all, just let you know that I do remember you, even though I known y'all for or only got to see you face to face for 3 months. But just let you know, I do love y'all, promise. So, for this lesson, we're going to go over Chapter 18, Lesson 3. It's about the South during Reconstruction. Miss Smith said y'all have covered just a little bit. I think the first half of the first Lesson 1 and a little bit Lesson 2. So, she said to go on and cover Lesson 3, and that's what we're doing. So, y'all should have your book, just like always. Hopefully, you haven't lost it. So y'all can follow along, if you want to. If you want to just listen to me, that's fine. However you want to do it, however it works with me. So the South during Reconstruction. The Reconstruction, just a little talk about it. It was after the Civil War. We finished the Civil War. And Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. He had a lot of plans, a lot of strategies he wanted to implement, and some worked, some didn't. Lincoln was a Republican, so there was the people who opposed him, or the people who supported him were Republican, obviously. But for Reconstruction, mostly the Republicans dominated. Their ideas is what went. Democrats, not so much. That's kind of like today's time. We can connect the Civil War and Reconstruction to today's time pretty well. But anyway, the Republicans controlled a lot of the Southern politics. And sorry, my cat's meowing. Ignore it. Republicans were in the North, Democrats were in the South. So it really bothered people in the South that there's my cat. It bothers people in the South that the Republicans were completely taking over their politics, telling them what to do, just like it would today in this world. If we had a Democrat president, the Republicans would backfire, be like, hey, I don't like this, normal politics. State governments, most of them, they all supported the Republican Party. So even some in the South, they wanted the Republican Party to be their main political party. There we go. Got it out. At this point, okay, Lincoln has already put in his Emancipation Proclamation. So that was to help free slaves, kind of end slavery. But you'll learn at the end of this video that slavery really hadn't ended that much. It just kind of died down. It had different perspectives and just different ways to pretty much say it wasn't slavery, but it was. I'll explain it better at the end. But so African Americans, Emancipation Proclamation, they had already went through free slaves, that kind of stuff. So at this time, African Americans were able to kind of get into politics, into the government. They were able to vote. Black men were able to vote. Most people think that in the 1960s, that was when, during the Civil Rights Movement, is when black people of any race or any other race could vote. But it was actually during Reconstruction that black people could vote. Black men could vote, at least. Most people don't know that, and it's crazy. But African Americans were also, they could be elected officials. Now, these officials, we're not talking about governor, secretary of state, not that kind of stuff. This is bottom of the pole, mayor, maybe. That could be a mayor. It wasn't too crazy. For a really short time during Reconstruction, African Americans, sorry, they held the majority in the lower house of the South Carolina legislature. And by that I mean, most of them were African Americans, and that's hard to believe, especially in South Carolina, because South Carolina was part of the South. So the South, obviously, it's part of the South. I'm talking about the South, but the South was really stepping up their game for including different races, trying to get it back to normal. At least it seems like it was. The thing about it, though, not counting South Carolina, is that the number of African Americans actually holding positions in the South was really small. Um, they didn't control any state government, so that's what I was saying. If they were elected officials, they were at the bottom of the poll like a mayor. It wasn't, even a mayor is kind of iffy if they could have. They probably weren't supported that well. They, like I said, in the South, I really doubt that people wanted an African American in front or over them, especially if it might have been like one of their slaves or something. They came back to the South to be the mayor and in the town of their slaveholder. I don't feel like it would have went over very well. But for the national government, or for the South's national government, you got to remember that there was two different national governments. You had the North's government, and then you had the South's government. But so for the South, there's actually 16 African Americans serving in the House, and there was 2 that served in the Senate between 69 and 1880. Sorry. So that was 1869 to 1880 is the time of Reconstruction. So that's pretty significant, and it really looked like it was becoming hopeful for African Americans. But you'll learn later in the video that it kind of went downhill. The South was very resistant to Reconstruction. Like we said, one of the things is African Americans, they were starting to get more rights, and South didn't want that. South was all pro-slavery. We've talked about this for weeks now, or at least 2 weeks, I know for sure. So pro-slavery South, they didn't want African Americans to have any rights. They didn't want them to vote. They didn't want to run for office. Nothing. So to kind of, I guess, even this out, kind of the slavery thing and running for office, white landowners, they wouldn't rent land to freed slaves. So these freed slaves, they when they were free, they were on their own. They didn't have money because they didn't get paid for slavery. They didn't have their own house, didn't have their own land, nothing. They were by themselves completely. So it really stinks that these freed slaves came like hundreds of miles across the state to get somewhere, to get away from their old life. And they get over here and ask to rent land, and the guy's like, no, you were a slave. I'm not going to do it. Also, if they move to this new town and say they're trying to build a house, a small little house, just to get a roof over their head. If they go to the store, back then people used credit a lot because most people were more trustworthy and they didn't have a lot of technology. But people like farmers could come in, charge some feed or something, seeds, something along the lines, and then a month come back and pay it off because say they bought feed and the cows have shipped off to the butcher and they finally got paid, so they can come pay their feed bill. So say that this slave wants to come and get some supplies to build his house, and he can't charge them, but he has no money. He just was freed, so he has no money, he has no job, he has no way to pay for it, and they won't let him charge. So how is he supposed to build a house? That's just how the South was, especially during this time. They didn't want to help him. And another thing is nobody would hire them either, so they had no way of getting money. The only time they did get hired is if there was a job that a white person didn't want. They weren't willing to do it. They didn't want anything to do with it, and they couldn't. And they just couldn't find anybody to do it, so they hired an African American to do it. And it was probably paid like a penny an hour, maybe a little bit more, but just to kind of get the gist, it wasn't a lot at all. Another thing that really kind of was against Reconstruction and really affected African Americans is the Ku Klux Klan. I know we've all heard about this. The KKK, white robes, white hats, cover their face with little eye holes and mouth holes. You've probably seen movies with it, showing them on their horses, probably like on their white horses and in their robes. So you've probably seen them actually have an African American. I hate to be this vivid, but they've hung African Americans, or they set them on fire. They were a crazy Klan. I mean, and there's even talks about today that the Ku Klux Klan is still around. But they, like I said, they used fear and violence, like hanging and fire, anything to get their point across. Even sorry, anything to hurt the African Americans and their families. They denied their rights to freed men and women. So just like white landowners and stuff refusing to rent out land to the freed slaves, they did the same thing, but they used more violence than the landowners did. They threatened, they beat, they killed, they burned, anything you can think of, anything violent. They killed so many African Americans, and even people who supported these freed slaves. They killed them. They thought that it was wrong, and that they were doing a great thing, and that's what they should have been doing. So, like I said, they killed probably thousands, more than, tons of people, just because they supported these freed slaves. And that's just crazy, especially in a world thinking about today. The Civil War is 120 years ago, a little bit over, actually 150 years ago, and that's really not that long ago, and it's crazy how much has changed since then. But so one of the things Congress did to try to chill out the KKK a little bit, they passed laws to stop the growth of the KKK and to try to stop their violence. But these weren't effective. They didn't, because these laws that were passed were probably Congress who passed them were probably people who didn't support the freed slaves. So they were like, we'll make these to make some people happy, but we're not going to enforce them. It was like that kind of deal. Also, if something did happen with the KKK in somebody's community, they weren't going to testify against the KKK. They were probably afraid that if they did, that the KKK would come after them, and that's definitely not somebody you want on your tail, especially during that time. So the KKK was serious. They were very, very dangerous, and I don't know too much about it, but I don't know if people were ever caught for the KKK, because back then it wasn't a I don't know, I guess it wasn't considered murder maybe, but I know some were caught, but I don't know if they ever dissolved or got in trouble. That's something you could probably look into. It might be a little interesting. Last thing, we talked about, I was talking a little bit about slavery, and how slavery kind of didn't end. Sharecropping, you've probably heard this a little bit. Sharecropping is kind of what replaced slavery. Sharecropping, this is where landowners rented land to farmers or freed slaves, and they would provide the supplies and the seeds and kind of anything they needed, but they charged them a percent of the crops that the freed slaves grew. Usually this percent was really unfair, and it usually left the freed slave with literally nothing. Maybe, say you grow $20 worth of crops. The landowner might take 75% of it, so that's, $5 left for a family of 4, say that. And it's not a lot today, and it probably still wasn't a lot back then for a family of 4. These free people, they just freed slaves. They just wanted farmland. They wanted something to kind of call their own. They wanted something that would provide them with something to do, something that just gives them a sense of dignity and pride. But they were really denied this. And like I said, this was how, this is basically what slavery was replaced with. And it still wasn't fair. It was still like the landowners, it was like they still owned them and they still controlled them, which they did. But it was more legal now. It wasn't looked upon as slavery. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about their education. So, slaves back during the Civil War and before the Civil War, it was illegal to educate slaves. They couldn't teach them to read or write. If you got caught teaching a slave to read or write, you were probably went to jail. So after Civil War and Reconstruction started, the government, started creating public schools for both races. So, in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, it's when integration started. It's when, like, the Literate 9, you'll learn about that too in high school, but the Literate 9 integrated, that's really how segregation and stuff started. But actually, most people don't know that back during Reconstruction and during the Civil War, men were allowed to vote, and then schools were trying to be integrated. Now, laws were placed, but they were not enforced at all like they were in 1960 to get schools integrated. They were still one of the first schools to be built. It was about 50% white and then about 40% African American. So that's actually successful during that time. But eventually it just kind of died off, and integration didn't stick because, like I said, the laws weren't enforced. So it was crazy. During this time, the North also set up academies in the South, and these academies, they were basically schools, like public schools, and both races, they were able to attend. But as time moved on, these academies turned into colleges and universities for African Americans. So there are still a few, even here in Arkansas. I think Philander Smith is even one. I'm not 100% sure, but I think Philander is one. So, like I said, these integration laws, it was a great thought, and at the time, and I know they were trying to rebuild the country, but they didn't enforce it enough. It didn't stick, and at the time they probably didn't even want it to stick because there were still people who were alive who thought it was still illegal to educate African Americans, and it just didn't stick. So y'all are great. Y'all are awesome. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for treating me as your own teacher. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I wish we ended different. I wish we I don't know, I wish it was just a better year, kind of. But hopefully I'll see y'all next year. And if y'all ever want to holler at me, contact me, anything, you know how to get to me. Hopefully I'll see you around town or in Walmart. Don't be afraid to talk to me. I'm pretty cool. We talked about this. So, finish your assignment, please. It's the last assignment for me ever. And unless you have me next year. And, y'all are awesome. Hopefully I'll see y'all soon.